Thanks for joining today. We'll get started in just a minute. Welcome. Thanks for joining. Thanks for joining, everybody. It's great to be with you. Terrific, thanks. Thanks for joining this very important kickoff of a fabulous paper. Today we have a great set of presentations and esteemed panelists. And the topic here is political economy. And what we know is, despite overwhelming evidence that there are tremendous benefits of ambitious climate action, from social benefits to economic benefits to environmental benefits. And there are so many studies, countless studies, that show that the benefits outweigh the costs. But yet only a handful of countries have political commitments that are in line with meeting the Paris Agreement goals. And it's so easy to say that this is a failure of political will, but what does that even actually mean? Given, if you look at high income countries and the failure to have action commensurate with the scale of the problem, it's apparent that it's not necessarily only due to capacity or access to technology or expertise alone. And how do we actually build political will in countries? Today, we are launching a guide for assessing the political economy of domestic climate change governance, which really shows how this can be done and unpacks this concept of political will and political economy. The way that we're going to work today is I'm going to give some brief framing remarks. My colleague Jesse Worker is then going to present on the paper and its findings, and then I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Uttara Narayan, who's going to present on some of the piloting of this framework in India. And then we're going to be moving on to a panel discussion with three esteemed panelists, James, Nikki, and Tasneem, and we'll move into Q&A. And you can see a Q&A function in this Zoom webinar if you have any questions at any time. I just wanted to step back and provide a little bit of framing for why we are here today. If you zoom back about 50 years, there was this seminal publication in Science where Gary Hardin reported about a new class of problems that presented what we all know is a tragedy of the commons. And this was the problem itself defied any technical solution. And Gary Hardin described a situation in which herders were locked into this system that required them to increase their herds without limit to satisfy their own interests. And as a result, there's a famous quotation in that paper that freedom in the commons brings ruin to all, and that the commons is overgrazed to the point by which it can no longer carry the cattle. Since then, scholarship, since Hardin's seminal piece, for example, by Elinor Ostrom, has pointed out that communities can develop institutions that successfully govern these shared resources. And if you look at human-induced climate change, it's a type of, one could call it a super wicked problem that presents a similar tragedy of commons, which Hardin described back then. Current institutions are locking into a system, again, similar to what Hardin described, in which individual and collective behavior really just goes towards a carbon intensive trajectory. But similar to Ostrom, one could argue that new institutional arrangements, new ways in which you can frame individual and collective interests, norms and behaviors could be turned and could reverse such path-dependent trajectories. And the challenge for policy analysts is really that they must counteract this tendency towards locking in this perverse behavior and consider instead how you could adjust policy in a way today to lock in and constrain our future emitting selves. And human-induced climate change, there are so many significant challenges that differ from traditional problem solving. And first, unlike other problems, which you can walk away from the negotiating table and come back, time is running out so acutely with climate change. At some point, some tipping points will be too late to stop or reverse. And unlike other environmental problems with very discrete antagonists and protagonists, human-induced climate change results from individual and collective activities at multiple scales, as well as activities in the market. And there's also no central authority. Public authorities don't control all of the choices that need to be made to alleviate pressures on the climate. And the lack of this centralized governance has repercussions at multiple levels because responses require coordination, not just among states, but which are themselves in a variety of different circumstances, but across different sectors and policy subsystems at multiple political levels. And the other very large challenge is that we discount the future irrationally. And similar to the herders in Hardin's example, who witnessed the degradation of the commons, even in the face of overwhelming evidence of the risks of significant or even catastrophic impacts from inaction, we're inclined to make decisions that disregard this information and that reflect very short time horizons. So this is our decisive decade. We have a tremendous emissions gap. And while we see very exciting momentum, for example, towards net zero commitments by mid-century, there's a huge discrepancy between these mid-century commitments and short-term ambition. And thus far, governments are missing an opportunity by not only investing in low carbon solutions and climate adaptation as part of their COVID recovery plans. And as I said in the beginning, capacity building and finance and technology transfer are critical, but these alone are not going to drive sufficient ambition if you just look at the G20. And it's easy to lament this lack of political will, but that doesn't really tell us much about what key decision makers see as aligned with their interests or not aligned with their interests, which constituencies could have greater influence, why certain mandates are more effective in one context than another. And at the same time, we do know that progress is possible. In some sectors and in some jurisdictions, we see transformational change, both in terms of scale and pace. And it's essential to figure out what's the special sauce or the ingredients of this change. So we must understand political economy better, and we need to ensure that the incentives of implementing agencies are aligned so there is institutional support to weather the shifts in political power. And since we can't avoid politics, we can do our best to understand them and support national partners in finding solutions. So this is really what today is about. Political economy analysts are looking at the history, the institutions, also behind the marginalization and exclusion of certain social groups, so that efforts moving forward are also equitable and well-informed. So today we're unraveling what on earth it means if we only just had political will. And we look forward to hearing from our speakers on how they've applied political economy analysis to their work and what lessons can be shared from that. And we're also really looking forward to hearing from you in the questions and answer period at the end. So let me turn this over to my colleague, Jesse Worker, who's an associate in our governance program and a lead author on this paper. Thanks. Over to you, Jesse.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And thank you everyone for being here today. I'm sharing my screen right now, so you should see the presentation on your screen. Somebody will count on a colleague to pipe up if that is not showing. So just to hammer home what Kelly's saying, this again. Sorry. Oh.
Duplicate the display setting. Yep.
Thank you. So just to hammer home what Kelly was saying, this is from the Climate Action Tracker. And what you see here, these colors represent green is on track for a 1.5 degree to a fair contribution to a 1.5 degree target in terms of both climate policy commitments and climate policies being implemented. Yellow is on track for 2 degrees Celsius. Orange is insufficient, red is highly insufficient, and gray is critically insufficient. So you can see right here, and this was as of November 2020, the number of wealthy nations or rapidly developing nations that are not on track. So if you need a compelling case for why we need to understand and think through the political economy of climate action better, and that while finance and technology transfer and capacity building, as Kelly laid out, are absolutely critical, we need additional attention on what's going to get domestic politics in line in the short term and the long term. So just bringing in, this is from the UN emissions gap report from 2020. It couldn't be, I think, any clearer in what needs to happen. As Kelly said, especially in the near term, to match short-term ambition with long-term mid-century targets. So, it's not only about mitigation though. There's immense amounts of political economy aspects to adaptation, including whose needs are prioritized, and does that correspond to vulnerability assessments that countries themselves have carried out. So I think we might have some of the co-authors of this figure on top. 32 to 132 million additional people anticipated to be in extreme poverty by climate change unless significant action is taken. From the Global Commission on Adaptation, their 2019 Adapt Now report, we know that 1.8 trillion invested in 5 key adaptation areas could produce 7.1 trillion in net benefits from 2020 to 2030. So the argument is there, the economic rationale is there, and this is just from 2 months ago in January at the Climate Adaptation Summit, where 40 governments, international organizations, and NGOs came together to adopt principles of locally led adaptation. And this is just pulling directly from the press release on that. And you can see clearly the recognition that we need to focus on devolving power and finance down to those who need it most. So a recommitment to the principle of subsidiarity. So if I don't effectively make this argument today, hopefully these folks will as well. So what's the governance challenge that connects to the climate challenge? One of the reasons that the Paris Agreement was able to happen was because of a monumental shift towards voluntary nationally determined contributions. So while countries agreed on a temperature target and they agreed on procedures of reporting, how they meet that target is something that they determine nationally. But that means, of course, that this rests on domestic governance and politics, the ability of countries to both raise ambition, to address adaptation in an equitable manner, and to ensure that they can ratchet ambition over time. So, even when countries, and it's not, just to emphasize, it's not only about making these ambitious political commitments. I would, note that many of you might be aware that there's now over 2,000 climate laws that the London School of Economics and the Grantham Institute have tracked over the last 10 or 15 years. Yet we're still in this, we still have this massive ambition challenge. So there's critical supportive governance that we need to understand that, is going to look different in different countries based on their institutions, their political context, and their histories. And that may sound, we're trying to do is make that a little less vague and amorphous. So what kind of structures and incentives are in place? What are the relationships between key actors? What drives them to make different decisions? And what potentially could get them to shift their positions? And some of this was born out of a little bit of frustration with hearing, lack of political will raised so many times, as Kelly said. And so what do we know about what's going to drive and sustain political support? And luckily, there's been excellent work on this in other fields. And part of this is to try to build more of this into to the understanding and analysis in the climate policy community. So what we're trying to do with this paper today, in simple terms, provide climate change advocates and practitioners with a more systematic way to consider domestic political economy as it applies to their specific climate governance challenges. What that means is that it's a problem-driven assessment. So we work with national partners who have identified a climate governance challenge from their observation or something that they anticipate, and we work from there to tailor the assessment that they need. And ultimately, what we hope to have as part of how we want to drive outcomes is to help develop more politically savvy strategies for how to enact and implement climate policies and actions. We'll get into a few details of what that could look like. So this is a little bit of a self-deprecating slide. It's kind of looking back on how in the past maybe we've hoped to seek change through governance, and maybe a strong focus on laws, to finding high-level political leaders who make supportive statements, providing the capacity, the tools, et cetera, and then let's hope that leads to action and change. And so, but at least speaking for myself, and working on issues of transparency and accountability, we oftentimes saw this implementation gap of where we would have strong laws being passed, and the institutions, the willingness to enable those with the necessary finance and human capacity wasn't there. So what's the problem there? These are just a few potential. I'm not going to read them all out. You can read them yourself. But just this is how I see a connecting sort of the governance and the political economy. What's driving leadership? We know that leaders, if they're politically elected, they may be voted out. So what's going to drive consistent political support over time? There's decades of evidence of capacity building not leading to actual change in behavior. So what can we learn from that? Who is organized around in support or against any particular policy? And those set of actors is going to vary. If it's around agriculture, if it's around infrastructure, depending on what the climate policy is, we need to have an adapted political economy assessment. So just quickly, I'm going to run over our approach for how we intend for this to be used. Domestic scale, it's being piloted at the subnational level in India, and Uthra will talk more about that. And in Brazil, our colleagues who are just getting started, so we're not going to talk about that yet, but they're working on it at the national level. It's meant to be at both scales. As I mentioned already, problem-driven, and it's adaptable to be tailored to context. And we envision this as civil society, but in some countries, you do have multi-sectoral coalitions that include government that are working from the inside to drive climate action. I don't want your eyes to glaze over. I'm just going to quickly give you a sense of what kind of questions we have built into this assessment for those who are interested. So, structural questions, these are common to political economy assessments. What we've tried to do is make them a little more tuned to, and in some cases they share the same types of questions, but a little bit more tuned to the climate challenges, both around adaptation and mitigation. Questions on rules and norms. So what are not only the mandates and the formal structures, but we know that it's critical to understand the informal, the governance, the World Development Report, Governance and the Law laid that out really, really well in 2017. And so, we've seen that, of course, through our own work, where there's norms, especially around who gets to participate or whose input is taken seriously. The relationships between both different political actors, different agencies, the power dynamics there. And then there's really good evidence on that, that the number of veto points and the types of veto points, in other words, where policies can be stopped, is really critical to understanding what the chances are to getting them enacted and making them successful. And questions on stakeholders and interests. So understanding, both the types of patronage politics, how stakeholder groups see climate policy as relevant to their interests. I think that some on this have been working towards trying to build a broader understanding of what some of the co-benefits of climate action are. We know that we're going to need diverse coalitions to drive and sustain political and policy change. Understanding the distributional impacts of climate policy, of course. And then I would argue also, we've seen a shrinking of civil society space, attacks on environmental activists. And I put that question, and you're welcome to weigh in the questions and answers, but I think that that's something that the climate community needs to be very aware of and taken seriously as well. And finally, something that you don't always see in political economy assessments, but something that we do think is important is sort of the prevailing ideas on what the problem is, how it should be addressed, what are the appropriate solutions, what are competing ideas. That's certainly been a case in terms of what is possible for energy options, dominant narrative on climate change risks. There's been great work done in South Asia by Action on Climate Today on this, and others that have shown the importance of that. Really quickly, this is just to show that we do see this as not a one-off, but an iterative assessment. We have tried to make it something that is that can be done a little bit more light touch, and it's not something that's going to be incredibly resource intensive for organizations that may not have a lot of resources, and understanding that political economy is dynamic and these conditions change. So this is just a few examples I'm not going to dive into, but if you're still wondering, why is this important? Understanding the context, common policies are not developed in a vacuum. So understanding that social political context is really important. This is really important too, and I think it's maybe something that there could be more attention on, is the way in which policies could be designed and communicated so that the benefits that they create help to build constituencies that then become advocates for the policy and kind of lock in that policy and make it more difficult to repeal. I think there's a lot of interest on what we can do, and I think there's some great work on that in terms of feed-in tariffs and the way that that's led to new constituencies and others. And I would just put this out there for those who are researchers and practitioners. These are, to me, part of this is bringing together the climate and governance communities a little closer and getting them to share their learning. So these are some key questions that I think are really critical questions to understand. Maybe those of you in the audience feel that you're developing answers. If so, please do reach out to us. But I think these are critical questions going forward as we try to understand what's going to make accountability work. Are these new forms of deliberative policymaking we see happening? How can they shift what the challenges have been in the past? Coordination is commonly cited as governance challenge, but that's a long-standing governance problem, and we know that just setting up interministerial committees is oftentimes not sufficient. So how do we get those to work effectively? Uttara, I'll pass it to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Jesse. Hello, everyone. Before we dive into how we are piloting the guidebook and the political economy approach in India, let me briefly introduce you to the institutional landscape of climate governance. Here, in this slide, we have laid out some of the most prominent initiatives at the national, state, and city level that define climate action. At the national level, we have climate targets that are informed by the Paris Agreement, of course, as well as the National Action Plan on Climate Change with sectoral missions on solar, sustainable habitat, energy efficiency, to name a few. Now, these efforts are also supported by various other national ministries. Based on these national targets and the policy intent that's designed at that level, states formulate their own action plans on climate change, renewable energy policies, disaster management plans, among others. Cities are also increasingly becoming sites of climate action. One example is the Climate Smart City Assessment Framework that's been developed by the National Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. Now, most of these mandates and the financial instruments to operationalize them flow from the top to more decentralized jurisdictions. But climate action is also supported by various non-state actors, such as research institutes, development banks, civil society, and the private sector. These actors provide varying degrees of support on finance, capacity, program design, and so forth. So this makes climate governance in India complex, varied, and multi-scale. Next slide, please, Jesse. Thank you. So through our piloting efforts in India, we would like to understand the political economy factors that inform city-level climate action. Globally, the Paris Agreement, as well as SDG 11 on sustainable cities, emphasize the significance of urban climate action. In India, cities are at the forefront of climate action, either through national and state policies, such as the Smart Cities program, or collaboration with non-state actors such as ICLEI and C40 cities. However, cities mostly do not possess the conventional policy instruments, capacity, or mandates that sort of, I'm going back to that slide that Jesse spoke about in the self-deprecatory manner. But yeah, they don't have these conventional instruments to act on these climate responsibilities because these continue to emanate from national or state mandates. Next, Jesse. So what this has resulted in are short-term project-based approaches that do not sufficiently mainstream climate action and hence run the risk of inadvertently contributing to increased vulnerability. These siloed approaches are further complicated by overlapping jurisdiction between these agencies with little coordination across sectors that also force informal shadow agreements. Therefore, a political economy lens becomes imperative to understand the systemic factors, formal and informal norms, interest and influence of key stakeholders, and the ideas that hold power over these climate action narratives and how they play out. Next slide, please, Jesse. So in India, Indore, Kochi, Pune, and Surat are the 4 cities where we are piloting the guidebook. We have selected these cities using a combination of reasons. First is the history of climate action initiated in these cities. Second, the diversity in governance approaches that they adopt, their political priorities and how they are aligned across the state and national levels, as well as the legacies that they have held in the past. To give you a flavor of some of these characteristics, here are a few examples. In 1994, Surat suffered an outbreak of the plague. Experience from that event led the city to having a pronounced emphasis on health within all its development plans, much before the idea of integrating health into resilience and adaptation became a prominent mainstream discourse. Kochi, as you can see on the map, is a coastal city with considerable area that's in the backwaters. So the city has always been acutely aware of sea level rise and flooding. Indore has also historically been conscious about water conservation. And similarly, Pune's sustainability efforts, especially around solid waste management and transport, have civil society voices featuring quite prominently. Third and finally, WRI's own experience of working in these geographies. Next, please, Jesse. So here are some initiatives, partnerships, and analytical frameworks that we have developed in the past that we have been applying in these cities, such as the Building Efficiency Accelerator, the Cities for Forests Initiative, Urban Climate Resilience Assessment, the World Resources Report case studies on inclusive cities, to name a few. So this also gives us some familiarity with the sites we would like to study. Next, Jesse. So this is an emerging context, and as we are in the process of piloting this guidebook, through this systematic political economy assessment, we hope that cities can learn from each other and amplify ongoing efforts in these sites. Most importantly, we expect that the analysis helps actors become more sensitive to historic exclusionary pathways of climate action and ensure that we don't repeat them. Local priorities need not always be welfare oriented and can be influenced by powerful lobbies at multiple levels. So an informed understanding of the power dynamics between stakeholders can ensure approaches are contextual and responsive to those social realms that they operate in. This should hopefully lead to more inclusive and participatory approaches that go beyond the short-term projects that we are mostly witnessing at the moment, and help understand opportunities beyond infrastructure creation and the performative management of civic responsibilities. Next, Jesse. So a political economy assessment enriches our stakeholder engagement. So we hope this assessment will help us understand voices with a more representative lens. An example, in Kochi, the fisher community has been at the front line of rescue and relief operations during the most recent floods of 2018 and 2019. And therefore, it's important to ensure that they have a say in discussions around rebuilding the city. The other thing is that also that such an analysis would help shift engagement beyond bureaucratic and experts-driven processes, which tend to sort of take on a certain hegemony in terms of, whose voices get counted. So this should also push us to think of legislators and other representative actors and how they can be included in our own approach towards climate action. And finally, next slide. Yeah, thanks, Stacey. And finally, while cities are sites where this action is happening, it will also help us truly realize that city-level climate action is a multi-scale governance process. Notable works so far on understanding, city-level climate action sort of lucidly explain how city governments, especially bureaucracies, respond to these climate action responsibilities. Some of these works also critique how these approaches might not necessarily lead to ideal and socially equitable outcomes and could also be maladaptive. Through our piloting efforts, we hope to understand why these actions are taken up in the way they are to better unlock the opportunities towards more equitable climate action at decentralized levels. So thank you. That's it, Jesse. Thank you.
Terrific, terrific. Thanks so much. Thanks. We're really looking forward to your results. Terrific. So I'm going to open this up to a panel, and we're lucky to be accompanied by three esteemed panelists. One is James Murumbedzi, who's a senior climate governance expert at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. James's areas of expertise include climate change policy and governance, natural resource management, land reform, and environmental policy. He previously worked as a coordinator of the Responsive Forest Governance Initiative for the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, UNDP, as a senior technical advisor, the IUCN as a regional director for Southern Africa, Ford Foundation, and also a lecturer at the University of Zimbabwe. We're also joined by Nikki Palmer, who is an independent international development consultant. She focuses her work on development, governance, and political economy. She was also a co-author on the research that you just heard about from Jesse. She has over 20 years of experience in international development and humanitarian assistance with a focus on political economy and conflict analysis. And lastly, but not least, Tasneem Essop, who's the executive director of CAN International. She's just completed her second term as commissioner in the National Planning Commission in South Africa, appointed by the president, where she led the work on climate change and the just transition. She previously headed the climate team at WWF International, served as the head of delegation for the organization at the UNFCCC. She became a member of the provincial parliament in the Western Cape in 1994 and has held various positions accordingly until she resigned from politics. Tasneem was an anti-apartheid activist from an early age in different capacities until the democratic elections in 1994. And during this time, she was a student and youth activist, a teacher, and a trade unionist. So welcome all. It's so wonderful to have you here, and thanks so much for sharing your ideas with us. Let's start with Tasneem first, and then if James and Nikki want to respond as well, would really welcome them to do so. I'm wondering, Tasneem, if you agree with the premise that a deeper understanding of a country's political economy with regard to climate change is necessary and important for galvanizing change. And if so, can you provide any examples of how you or your partners are applying such analysis and if it's had any impact? Thanks.
Thanks very much, Kelly, and greetings to my fellow panelists and to all the participants. So, I mean, political economy analysis is for anybody working on change. And let's not only talk about climate change, but change of any kind. You know, having deep political economy analysis is almost fundamental to working for change. So I would argue, yes, agreed, it is critical for any work on trying to bring about change in different levels. I wonder, before I get into examples, Kelly, I think that, you know, it's almost instinctive if you're working for change that you would require the kind of deep political economy analysis. We need to understand, of course, how power is distributed, how power functions, who are the influences of decisions, both visible and invisible, what are the vested interests, and who are going to be the key drivers of different forms of change in that jurisdiction or in that society, etc. So yes, agreed. And then linked to that, of course, based on that analysis, and this doesn't have to be one big moment where you do one big analysis. It has to be, I understand this to be something that you do continuously. You have to, obviously, because things change, you need to do this on a continuous basis. And based on that analysis, then you actually going to be far better at defining your strategy and the tactics required to bring about particular changes. So for example, if you're wanting to make a policy shift, right? If you want to change policy, your strategy and your tactics would be very different to whether you're wanting to bring fundamental change in society, which is essentially what the IPCC is saying is needed to address climate change, to address this climate emergency. So you'll obviously be working at all those levels, immediate policy changes, but working towards the broader transformational change, that would require a different set of strategy and tactics. And again, your analysis might have to, you know, focus on different aspects of the political economy. So I just wanted to bring that additional thinking around why political economy analysis is important, because it does fundamentally inform your strategy and tactics. And then, of course, you know, well, my experience both in the kind of democratic government, but let me talk about before we were in you know, government in a new democratic South Africa, and the experience of our anti-apartheid struggle, because essentially that would be a good case to be looking at, you know, the practice of that, because it resulted in change. Of course, challenging still, you know, not entirely changed in South Africa. We still have our challenges, but certainly to win, you know, there's been decades long struggle, and then eventually to be able to win that freedom has many lessons. And for all those who were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle in whatever level and whatever form, this kind of analysis was, as I said, almost instinctive. It was our bread and butter work of constantly analyzing power, shifts in power, who are going to be the key drivers of change, how do we organize them, how does this influence strategy and tactics. And so from that experience, I sort of brought that experience as an anti-apartheid activist into government as well, because there you're not necessarily fighting for change because you have the power to change things as, you know, being a minister, but certainly to be able to also map out different interests. If you're wanting to move new policy initiatives that you're taking, there'll be resistance to it. You also do a similar thing. So of course, it gets applied to your role in government as well. Even though you do have power, you need to understand where, you know, stakeholders stand on particular issues, how you'd be able to shift them, etc. And then being in Cannes, well, then coming back into the environmental sector, into the NGO sector, basically, civil society, you know, as I said at the start, you cannot be working for change without doing political economy. We might give it different names. So, you know, some organizations will call it power mapping, you know, or stakeholder mapping. So there might be different ways of framing it, but certainly it is the bread, or should be the bread and butter work of any organization or individual working for change. I'll leave it there, Kelly.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Nick, just to ask you the same question, just wonder if you could reflect a little bit about the importance of performing an assessment like this.
Sure. Thank you, everybody. So the premise is that, you know, is a deep understanding of a country's political economy necessary in order to move along a change process? And I would certainly say, definitely, yes. I mean, I would say that, given that I'm a political economy practitioner and have been for many, many years. And I've sort of seen the evolution of this from a sort of development perspective and from a humanitarian perspective as well. And I would say Tasneem has said something really quite important in her comments, which is that for some, thinking about power, thinking about relationships, and thinking about the ways in which they influence change is instinctive. It's common sense, and you do it every day. Now, unfortunately, in a world of technical practitioners, in the development world, let's say, and in the humanitarian world, that hasn't always been the case. It seems to defy common sense in some ways, but in many cases, change processes were thought of as a sort of linear trajectory, that you start off with a programming input, a set of activities, you reach an outcome, and then you carry along to reach a goal by putting money and capacity as you go. And I think gradually over the last 20, 30 years, there has been a shift in that. Technical people like me have recognized that you can't do everything by best practice, especially when you don't understand the context. And it's taken us a very long time to come to terms with the fact that we don't necessarily understand the context that we're working in. I'm speaking now perhaps from the perspective of, let's say, some of the big donors, some of the big development actors around the world. So change happens, and it's a cyclical process. It comes and goes. There are various different power dynamics. You know, we know this, but it's taken us a long time to sort of catch up with, well, then how do we understand that, and how do we adjust change processes, adapt change processes into the needs of the context? I think I'd say that not everybody does that now, even though there has been many, many years of demonstrating that politics matters, political economy matters. So I would say probably simplistically that political economy analysis is an excellent way in which you can help to illustrate, you can help to kind of take a look underneath what's happening on the surface and work out what the constraints and potential enablers are to a certain type of change process. And as I indicated, the counterfactual to that is that if you don't pay any attention to those shifts in power, those different motivations, those incentives, then quite likely the change process that you're supporting, the program that you're supporting, won't work. And we've seen this happen time and time again, that a donor or a development actor will put money into something and it won't work for reasons that aren't immediately obvious. So certainly, political economy analysis is a very good route to understanding what's going on under the surface and recognizing constraints and enablers to change.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Nikki. Thanks, Tasneem. James, I'm wondering if you could just reflect a little bit about how political economy analysis has figured into your work. I think we've heard both from Tasneem and Nikki just that if you ignore it, often our interventions don't have the same kind of effect that we intend them to have. So maybe you could speak to that a little bit. I think you're on mute, James.
Oh, apologies. I think that Tasneem and Nikki have touched all of the important bases there. You mentioned at the outset, Kelly, that climate policy, the climate response itself is largely a problem of collective action. Now, collective action obviously involves a great deal of interaction between various interests would deploy different resources, different strategies, as my co-panelists have indicated, in terms of the programs and projects that they would deploy to achieve their different objectives. Now, from where I sit, we are really trying to understand the global political economy of climate change. We have talked about the national political economies and how different interests can be arranged in order to understand how national policies evolve. But we have to also acknowledge that national climate policies are constructed in a global context that currently is contextualized by the Paris Agreement, which is a negotiated settlement between the parties to the agreement. Part of the reason why, in fact, climate action has not resulted in the intended outcome of limiting the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is precisely because of the global political economy, the global distribution of power between the different actors. And one of the ways of understanding and beginning to predict how, in fact, the global arrangements can be improved in order for us to reach the scientifically determined objectives is obviously by understanding the political economy, how the different global interests are arranged and how they are interacting with each other. And there are very specific examples of how political economy approaches could predict how different actors are going to respond or are going to apply different policies. We could begin, for instance, with the Kyoto Protocol, which very clearly privileged technical managerial solutions rather than wholesale changes to economic systems of production, systems of consumption, systems of distribution. Because the assumption there was that, in fact, you could deploy technical approaches to resolve, to abate carbon dioxide emissions. Why that was the case was because, in fact, the dominant interest in the construction of the of the Kyoto agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, were those forces that reflected an interest in investment in technical solutions towards achieving the climate objectives. Similarly, if you look at the stage at which the Kyoto Protocol begins to actually fail or to recognize its own failures, you also see that some of the big polluters also begin to withdraw from the protocol. And those withdrawals were not coincidental. They were actually withdrawals that were informed by interactions between political stakeholder interests within those large emitting countries, which actually led to this solution becoming unviable. Similarly, if you look at the Paris Agreement, perhaps the Paris Agreement is more poignant in the sense that it is more recent, but also you had a withdrawal of a major country. When President Trump was withdrawing the US from the Paris Agreement, he actually did state that his interest was in Pittsburgh and not in Paris. So very clearly, he was saying that his decision was determined by the interest of the steel, the coal mining, and other polluting industry, rather than by the global interest in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But all this is predictable if you apply a political economy approach, because then you can actually, if you follow the model that has been proposed in this study, you can actually identify the different stakeholders, the interests that they are likely to project in determining policy outcomes, the resources that are available to them to project those interests. And therefore, on that basis, you can understand the likeliest outcomes and develop strategies for countering those or for proposing different approaches to achieve different outcomes. I think you also propose the whole question of how you can ensure that policies are accountable. Again, accountability is a deep political economy question, and it's also clearly related to power, availability of resources, and ability to influence outcomes. So obviously, the most powerful interests there are those interests that are able to mobilize resources, which ensure that everyone is accountable to those interests. Or the least powerful are those interests that have the least capacity to demand accountability. Because accountability is demanded, right? It is not just available. But at the same time, accountability is the opposite side of responsiveness. So you could, as your model clearly identifies, you could actually develop a policy framework which makes it possible for the development of responses and climate actions that would achieve the climate objectives. But that policy framework has to be able to be responsive to the needs of the different actors and the different interests. And responsiveness is also a function of power, of resources. And power here, I think, includes political power, political capacity, the capacity to mobilize, the capacity to convene, the capacity to create spaces even for policy discussions. All of these are very important political constructs at the global level. And my argument is that the global level conditions the political economies that affect the climate response at the national level. And all of these are actually linked. So we need to have that broad understanding of political economies across the different scales.
Thanks, James. Yeah, excellent points. I mean, I think there's so many interconnected pieces here in terms of power dynamics and the stakeholders involved and accountability. Tasneem, I was wondering, you've had the privilege of serving as the Commissioner of South Africa's National Planning Commission, as well as serving as the head of CAN International. And given that you've experienced both inside and outside government, how do you think actors on both sides can work to shift incentives, to strengthen accountability mechanisms, to collaborate more effectively, to really get implementation going much more quickly?
Sorry, I was muted. again, I mean, I think that, of course, it depends on what the common cause is, right? I mean, not all, this is exactly the topic of this discussion. How do we shift political will? What is political will, etc.? I mean, do not underestimate the power of an individual politician, especially. And sometimes there's a notion that, oh, we can't do this because of all these reasons, etc., that many politicians present is, as if they don't have power, is incorrect. So recognizing that, individual politicians can make a difference. And if you are really committed to bringing about this, addressing the climate emergency, you will, in fact, be a champion and lead that process. And if that is your intention, you would do this kind of political economy analysis as well. You would understand, because it's highly contested in any national situation, as we've heard. There are vested interests, different interest groups, etc. So you have to have that kind of analysis to determine who your allies are, how you build the critical mass to get behind the kinds of shifts you want to make politically. So the same is true for the other side as well. The same is true for the other side as well. If you're outside of government, you don't have the power to do that. There's a notion that power is all about having political power in the official sense, but we know that people have power. So what you will do on the outside is do the analysis, understand, again, as I said, who are going to be the drivers of change, how you build and organize a critical mass for that change behind you. So you'd need to do this both sides. But the magic of all of that would, of course, be when these forces collaborate. Because, positioning these as oppositional forces cannot be sustained for very long. At some point, we are going to have to, we're going to recognize that we are all in this together and we are going to have to collaborate. So that is when the magic happens, when there's a coinciding of the political will and, the kind of power of people who want to see this change. I think that's probably the best moment of where all the things come together and your analysis hopefully had worked.
Fabulous, thanks. I'm going to invite Jesse and Udra to join us for some of the Q&A, but while we do that, Nikki, just to ask you one question. We know that a lot of organizations may find this useful for the many compelling reasons that you guys laid out, but they also might be very strapped for time and resources. And I'm just wondering, can you reflect a little bit about the ways in which researchers and advocates could integrate political economy assessment into their day-to-day lives, into their day-to-day work, instead of making this a one-off? Are there any kind of best practices that you've observed that you can share with us?
So I think in terms of best practices, it's been quite difficult actually for a lot of organizations to adopt this kind of in-depth analysis at the design stage of a program or a change process, which sort of speaks to one of the questions we got in the chat, which is why don't more organizations for which this should be their bread and butter, why don't they do it more regularly? So I think the thing is, a lot of organizations, certainly the ones that I work with, a lot of them are motivated and incentivized by spending money. They have an enormous amount of funding to spend. So they have their own political economy, and political economy analysis can lead to some uncomfortable truths. It certainly can raise questions about whether a certain course of action is the right course of action, although that course of action might be politically most favorable to the country that's supporting that course of action, for example. It might not be the best thing for that context, and many other, complex interactions. So it can be very difficult to do because it can raise uncomfortable truths, which have to be responded to. So that can be a difficulty. In terms of timing as well, I would say that a lot of organizations tend to undertake political economy analysis when there's a crisis or when something goes wrong. So, you know, I'm doing this huge health program and suddenly it doesn't look like we're going to get to the outputs that we had thought of. So let's do a political economy analysis. It's a good time to do a political economy analysis. It is likely to lead you to some uncomfortable truths. However, it's a better time to do a political economy analysis is at the start of a change process, or the start of a process where you want to encourage something else to happen at the end. Inevitably, if you think about deepening your understanding of a context before you start a process, before you start encouraging or supporting or promoting a process of change, you're more likely to get to an outcome that you want to, that is realistic within the context. In terms of doing it every day, political economy every day, there are guides on this that have been written, doing daily political economy analysis. I think there's one actually called that. I think the point for me is that when you start to see a change process, not as a series of technical steps, but as something that requires deep understanding of a context, and not just a one-shot understanding of a context, but continual, iterative analysis of a context, then it becomes something that you can kind of really work into what teams do, not just particularly that technical team that is implementing that particular project, but the whole office, what it does, the way it thinks, you know, that is the basis of the whole idea of working and thinking politically. Political economy analysis can help you to do that. I mean, in terms of sort of what are the tips and techniques to do that, then certainly, you know, put a team together, get started, use local knowledge. Everybody who's working within a country will have a certain amount of local knowledge. Things may feel sort of second nature that wouldn't to an outsider. So you can begin to put together those people who are from a context and not from a context to try and sort of work out what are the kind of rules, norms, informal ways that things work, rules of the game that you should start paying more attention to.
Terrific. Thank you. Thanks. I mean, it sounds like even though there are upfront costs to it, the payoffs seem quite significant. I'm wondering, Jesse, could you just spend only 2 minutes just reflecting on two questions? One, we have a question. Are there examples of how different government departments trump each other? The Environment Department, where climate change is often located, the Energy Department, which is focused on fossil fuel development. And then a second question, that climate change is becoming contentious, but it's urgent and critical. There's a leadership vacuum, especially in terms of leading powers. And what's your take on the lack of global leadership and what we can do about that? If you could just answer that in 2 minutes, thanks.
Yeah, well, it's a big one for 2 minutes. I'll try to do the first one. Yes, I think that definitely happens. There's been, you often hear climate policy people talking about, incoherence in that even though a country has a national plan that with targets of what it's trying to achieve, that the sectoral policies perhaps that were put in place before then are not in line with the national plan, or the implementing regulations don't follow the national policy. That's, I think, been true both it's been a challenge that's been well documented in mainstreaming and adaptation, but can also in implementing mitigation goals. Some of these challenges, I think, are playing out in real time because some of these policies and laws that have been enacted are quite recent, and so institutions are being developed. So there's not as much monitoring and evaluation of impact as we might like. But certainly, I think one of the, and this is, you'll hear this said frequently, but environment ministries typically are not one of the most powerful ministries. So I think one strategy has been to try to position oversight and coordination responsibility for bringing all ministerial leads together with perhaps under the executive branch, or with the Ministry of Finance, or with the Ministry of Planning, or a more empowered ministry that can essentially influence, might control budget, or might have other ways of kind of exerting its influence. I think the other thing is just making sure that sort of beyond just the ministers, that the incentives are in place for staff even below the ministers to be implementing effectively. Yeah, the global challenge, I mean, we are trying to make, I think there's a lot of great publications that have come out in terms of the, WRI did a big collaboration on the state of climate action. I don't know if we can address that in full, but we've certainly tried to, if you look at the outset of the paper, I think we addressed some of the challenges in terms of bringing it together. My argument that I'm trying to make is that we can't lean entirely on international diplomacy to drive ambition. That the domestic drivers of change are what's going to lead to greater ambition in international diplomacy. Is an argument I would make. So that's what we're trying. That's the argument we're trying to make and help advocates, and that we need to help develop these domestic coalitions to drive that change. I'll say, I know we're out of time, so thank you.
Terrific, thank you. Thanks, Jesse. It's a great point to end on. I mean, I think the challenges are multifold, as we saw, but the opportunities are significant. And even though it might take a bit of time to do a political economy analysis, there are ways, there are lots of tools out there, and it seems like it is clear that the benefits are really significant. If we have this very small window to act, let's make sure that our interventions are effective as they can be, and that they are fully implemented. So with that, I just want to thank our presenters and our panelists. This has been terrific, and I hope that everybody reads the report. If you have any questions, please feel free to be in touch with us. We'll also try to address some of the Q&As directly to those that asked it afterwards, and we'll be sharing a recording as well. So thank you very much. Great to have you all today. Take care.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.